Judge Kim Tae-ho rubbed his tired eyes and looked at the clock on the courtroom wall. It was only 9:30 in the morning, but he already felt exhausted. The stack of traffic violation cases on his desk seemed to grow taller each week. Speeding, tickets, parking violations, red light runners, the same boring cases day after day for 15 years. He picked up his coffee cup and took a long sip of the bitter liquid. The courtroom was filling up with people waiting for their cases to be called. Most of them looked nervous, fidgeting with papers or whispering to family members. Kim had seen it all before. These people thought they were special, that their excuses would somehow make their violations disappear. "Next case," Kim called out without looking up from his papers. "Lee Min-ah, traffic violation, speeding." A woman in her 30s walked to the front of the courtroom. Kim glanced at her briefly and then returned to his paperwork. She wore faded blue jeans and a simple black jacket that looked like it came from a discount store. Her long black hair was pulled back in a plain ponytail with a cheap rubber band. No makeup, no jewelry, no expensive handbag. Just another ordinary citizen who probably thought she could talk her way out of a ticket. Kim had developed a system over the years. He could tell within seconds what type of person stood before him. The wealthy ones wore expensive suits and brought lawyers. The middle-class ones dressed nicely and spoke politely. The poor ones looked exactly like this woman. Casual clothes, nervous expressions and stories about why they shouldn't have to pay their fines. "Ms. Lee," Kim said in a flat, bored tone, "you are charged with exceeding the speed limit by 20 kilometers per hour on Highway 42 last Tuesday at 3:15 in the afternoon. The police officer measured your speed at 70 kilometers per hour in a 50-kilometer zone. How do you plead?" Lee Min-ah stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back. She watched the judge carefully, noting how he barely looked at her, how his voice carried no interest or concern. This was exactly what she had expected to see. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I would like to explain the circumstances that led to this situation." Kim sighed loudly and finally looked up at her. "Ms. Lee, the circumstances are quite clear. You were driving 20 kilometers over the speed limit. The officer's radar reading is accurate. There's nothing to explain." "But," Lee Min-ah didn't back down. "Your Honor, I understand that the radar reading shows I was speeding. However, there were emergency circumstances that—" "Ms. Lee," Kim interrupted, his voice growing sharper. "I've heard every excuse in the book. Emergency circumstances, late for work, sick child, dying grandmother. The speed limit exists for everyone's safety. You broke the law." Around the courtroom, other defendants watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Some of them had been planning to explain their own circumstances, but now they wondered if the judge would even listen. Kim looked at his watch. At this rate, he would be here until lunchtime. He had a golf game planned for the afternoon, and he didn't want these simple traffic cases to ruin his schedule. "The fine for your violation is 200,000 won, Kim announced. "You can pay at the clerk's office or set up a payment plan. Next case." But Lee Min-ah didn't move. She remained standing at the defendant's table, watching the judge with calm, steady eyes. Kim noticed she wasn't nervous like most people in her position. She wasn't arguing or pleading. She was just observing. "Ms. Lee, you need to step aside, so we can proceed with the next case," Kim said, his patience wearing thin. "Your Honor," Lee Min-ah said quietly, "I believe there are some things you should know before we conclude this matter." Kim felt a small flutter of annoyance. Why couldn't this woman just accept her fine and leave like everyone else? He had given her the standard penalty for speeding. It was fair and legal. "Ms. Lee, the court has made its decision. Unless you plan to file an appeal, which you can do through the proper channels, this case is closed." Lee Min-ah reached into her simple black jacket and pulled out a leather folder. It looked expensive, much more expensive than anything else she was wearing. Kim noticed this detail but didn't think much of it. Maybe she had borrowed it from someone. "Your Honor," she said, placing the folder on the defendant's table, "I think you should know exactly who you have been addressing this morning." Something in her tone made Kim pause. The woman's voice had changed slightly. It was still, calm and respectful, but there was a new quality to it. Authority, maybe, or confidence. The courtroom had grown very quiet. Even the clerk, Park Soo-jin, had stopped typing and was watching the exchange with interest. Kim looked at Lee Min-ah more carefully for the first time. Her posture was perfect, her expression calm and professional. Despite her casual clothes, she carried herself like someone used to being in courtrooms, but not as a defendant. "What exactly are you trying to say, Ms. Lee?" Kim asked, feeling the first small stirrings of unease. Lee Minna opened the leather folder with slow, deliberate movements. Her fingers were steady as she pulled out an official document with government seals and signatures. The paper looked important, the kind that carried real authority. "Your Honor," she said, her voice now carrying a different weight, "I am Dr. Lee Minna, Chief Legal Consultant for the Korean Judicial Reform Commission." Judge Kim felt his stomach drop. The words hit him like a physical blow. His mouth went dry and he could feel sweat starting to form on his forehead. He stared at the woman standing before him, trying to process what she had just said. "I specialize in courtroom procedure analysis and judicial conduct evaluation," Lee Minna continued, placing the official document on the table where everyone could see the government letterhead. "I have been working in this field for 12 years. The courtroom was so quiet that Kim could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The other defendants who had been waiting for their cases stopped whispering. The attorneys in the back rows leaned forward in their seats. Even the court reporter had stopped typing and was staring at the scene unfolding before them. Kim tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Ms. Lee, Dr. Lee, I don't understand what you're trying to say." But even as he spoke the words, Kim knew exactly what she was saying. His 15 years of experience had taught him to recognize authority when he saw it. The way she stood, the way she spoke, the official documents. This was not an ordinary defendant trying to get out of a traffic ticket. "I have been commissioned by the Supreme Court Administration," Lee Minna said, pulling out another document, "to conduct undercover evaluations of district court proceedings across the country. This morning's session, including my own case, has been part of that official evaluation." Kim's coffee cup slipped from his shaking hand and crashed to the floor, sending brown liquid splashing across his black robes. He didn't even notice. All he could think about was how he had treated this woman, how he had dismissed her, interrupted her, refused to listen to her explanation. Park Soo-jin, the court clerk, gasped audibly. She had worked in this courtroom for 8 years and had never seen anything like this. She watched as Judge Kim's face went from red to pale white in a matter of seconds. Around the courtroom, the other defendants began to whisper to each other. An elderly man in the front row nudged his wife and pointed at Dr. Lee. A young woman who had been called for a parking violation covered her mouth with her hand, realizing she was witnessing something extraordinary. The Supreme Court Administration has been receiving complaints about inconsistent sentencing and procedural violations in district courts, Dr. Lee explained, her voice calm and professional. "They asked me to observe how cases are handled when judges don't know they are being evaluated." Kim tried to stand up, but his legs felt weak. He gripped the edge of his desk for support. "Dr. Lee, surely there has been some mistake. I was just following standard procedures." "Your Honor," Dr. Lee said, opening her folder wider, "I have been taking detailed notes throughout this morning's proceedings. I have documented the time spent on each case, the questions asked, the evidence reviewed, and the sentences given." She pulled out a small notebook filled with neat handwriting. "In the past hour, you have handled 12 cases. The average time spent per case was 2 minutes and 15 seconds. In my case, you spent exactly 1 minute and 43 seconds from the time I entered until you announced the fine." The numbers hit Kim like hammer blows. He knew she was right. He had been rushing through cases all morning, eager to finish his docket and get to his golf game. "You interrupted me when I tried to explain emergency circumstances," Dr. Lee continued. "You did not ask to see any documentation or evidence that might support my explanation. You imposed the maximum fine allowed by law without considering any mitigating factors." An attorney sitting in the back of the courtroom slowly shook his head. He had been watching the morning proceedings and had noticed the judge's rushed behavior, but he hadn't realized it was this serious. "Dr. Lee," Kim said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I can review your case again. Perhaps I was too hasty." "Your Honor," Dr. Lee replied, "any attempt to change your ruling now would be noted in my report as evidence that you knew your original decision was improper." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kim understood that no matter what he did now, he was in serious trouble. If he changed his ruling, it would prove he knew he had been wrong. If he didn't change it, the improper procedure would stand as evidence against him. Other defendants in the courtroom began to understand what this meant for their own cases. If the judge had been handling cases improperly, they might have grounds to appeal their fines and sentences. A middle-aged man who had been fined for a parking violation earlier raised his hand tentatively. "Excuse me, Your Honor, but does this mean, sir?" Dr. Lee said, turning to address him. "Any defendant who believes their case was not handled according to proper legal procedures has the right to file an appeal." Judge Kim sank into his chair, knowing that his career, his reputation, and his future were all hanging in the balance. Dr. Lee Minna reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Each page was covered with neat handwriting and official stamps. She placed them on the defendant's table in perfect order, like a lawyer preparing for an important trial. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and professional, "I have documented 17 specific procedural violations that occurred in this courtroom during the past hour alone." Judge Kim felt his throat tighten. 17 violations. The number seemed impossible, but as he watched Dr. Lee organize her papers, he realized she was completely serious. This wasn't a bluff or an empty threat. The first violation occurred at 8:45 this morning, Dr. Lee said, reading from her notes. "You failed to allow Mr. Park Dong-sik adequate time to present his case. He attempted to explain that his speedometer was broken, but you interrupted him after 15 seconds and imposed the fine." Kim remembered the case. The man had seemed nervous and was talking slowly, so Kim had cut him off to speed things along. At the time, it had seemed like efficient courtroom management. "The second violation occurred at 8:52, Dr. Lee continued. "You interrupted Mrs. Choi Young-hee's testimony without legal cause. She was explaining why she was parked in a disabled space, but you stopped her before she could show her medical documentation." Park Soo-jin, the court clerk, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She remembered that case too. The elderly woman had been fumbling with papers from her purse, and Judge Kim had grown impatient. Dr. Lee reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver device about the size of a phone. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, which is required by law but which you failed to mention to previous defendants, I have been recording these proceedings for official judicial review." The recording device seemed to fill the entire courtroom with its presence. Kim stared at it with horror, realizing that every word he had spoken, every dismissive comment, every interruption was now captured forever. "The recording is legal because I am conducting an official government investigation," Dr. Lee explained. "However, you are required by law to inform all defendants that court proceedings may be recorded. You failed to do this for any of the 12 cases heard this morning." Kim's hands began to shake visibly. He gripped the edges of his desk, trying to steady himself. Around the courtroom, people were starting to murmur among themselves. Some looked angry, others confused, but all were paying close attention to every word. Dr. Lee pulled out another set of official documents. These had red seals and signatures from high-ranking government officials. "These are my authorization. Papers from the Supreme Court Administration. They give me the legal authority to conduct this evaluation and to record all proceedings." She held up the papers so everyone in the courtroom could see them. The documents looked official and important, with government letterheads and formal language that made it clear this was serious business. "In my specific case," Dr. Lee said, returning to her notes, "you imposed the maximum fine of 200,000 won without reviewing any evidence that might support my explanation. You refused to allow me to present mitigating circumstances." She reached into her folder and pulled out a stack of medical papers. "I was speeding because I was responding to a medical emergency. My 78-year-old mother had fallen in her apartment and broken her hip. The hospital admission records are right here." Dr. Lee held up the medical documents. Kim could see they were official hospital papers with dates, times, and medical codes. They looked genuine and detailed. The emergency room records show that my mother was admitted at 3:37 that afternoon, Dr. Lee said, reading from the papers. The fall occurred at 3:15, exactly when the police officer recorded my speeding violation. I was rushing to the hospital to be with her during surgery. The courtroom was completely silent now. Several people looked uncomfortable, realizing they were witnessing something that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. "You didn't ask to see these documents," Dr. Lee continued. "You didn't ask about the circumstances of the violation. You simply imposed the maximum penalty without any consideration of the emergency situation." An elderly woman in the third row began to cry quietly. Her husband put his arm around her shoulders. They had been fined earlier for a parking violation, and now they were wondering if their case had been handled properly. Dr. Lee pulled out more papers from her folder. "I also have documentation showing that the average time spent on traffic cases in this district should be between 5 and 8 minutes per case. This morning, your average was 2 minutes and 15 seconds per case." She showed Kim a chart with numbers and statistics. "The state judicial guidelines require judges to allow defendants adequate time to present their cases and to review any evidence they wish to submit. You failed to do this in every single case." A young man near the back of the courtroom raised his hand tentatively. "Excuse me, Dr. Lee, but what does this mean for those of us who were already fined this morning?" Dr. Lee turned to address him directly. "Any defendant who believes their case was not handled according to proper legal procedures has the right to file an appeal. The court administration will review each case individually." Judge Kim felt the walls of the courtroom closing in around him. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for was crumbling before his eyes. Judge Kim felt panic rising in his chest like cold water. His mind raced, trying to find a way out of this terrible situation. Maybe he could fix this, somehow. Maybe there was still time to make things right. "Dr. Lee," he said, forcing his voice to sound calm and reasonable, "surely we can discuss this matter privately in my chambers. Perhaps I was being a bit hasty in my judgment of your case." The words came out desperate, even though Kim tried to make them sound casual. He stood up from his chair, gesturing toward the door that led to his private office behind the courtroom. "We could review your mother's medical records properly," Kim continued, his voice getting faster. "I'm sure we can reach a fair resolution that takes into account the emergency circumstances you mentioned." Dr. Lee looked at him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the entire morning. She didn't seem angry or upset. She just watched him with the professional detachment of someone doing a job. "Your Honor," she said in her steady voice, "any attempt to modify your ruling now would constitute judicial misconduct awareness under state legal guidelines." The words hit Kim like a physical blow. He felt his knees go weak and had to grab the back of his chair for support. The courtroom seemed to spin around him. "The Supreme Court administration specifically instructed me to document not just how judges handle cases, but how they respond when their conduct is challenged," Dr. Lee continued. "This is a critical part of the evaluation process." Kim's mouth went dry. He realized that every word he was saying, every gesture he was making was being carefully noted and would appear in Dr. Lee's official report. There was no escape. No way to undo what had already happened. Dr. Lee began gathering her papers with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the morning. Each document was placed in exactly the right spot in her folder. Her movements were calm and professional, like a doctor completing a routine examination. "My report will note that when confronted with documented evidence of procedural violations, you immediately attempted to alter your ruling," she said, not looking up from her papers. "This demonstrates clear knowledge that your original decisions were inappropriate and legally questionable." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kim understood that Dr. Lee was describing exactly how his actions would look to the Supreme Court administration. He wasn't just facing criticism for his handling of cases. He was now facing evidence that he knew his conduct was wrong. Park Soo-jin, the court clerk, watched the exchange with wide eyes. In her 8 years working in this courtroom, she had never seen Judge Kim look so frightened. His face had gone completely white, and sweat was visible on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Around the courtroom, the other defendants and attorneys were beginning to understand the full significance of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just about one woman's traffic ticket anymore. This was about the entire justice system and how it treated ordinary people. Dr. Lee finished organizing her papers and closed her leather folder with a soft snap. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silent courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, turning to face the people sitting in the courtroom seats, "I want to address everyone who appeared before this court this morning." Kim watched helplessly as Dr. Lee took control of his courtroom. There was nothing he could do to stop her. Any intervention now would only make things worse for him. Any defendants who believe their cases were mishandled this morning have legal grounds to file appeals, Dr. Lee announced clearly. The court administration will be conducting a comprehensive review of all proceedings that took place during today's session. A middle-aged woman in the front row raised her hand nervously. "Dr. Lee, does this include the parking ticket I received? The judge didn't let me explain that I was loading medical equipment for my disabled son." "Yes, ma'am," Dr. Lee replied. "Every case will be reviewed. You have the right to present evidence that wasn't considered during your original hearing." An elderly man stood up slowly, using his cane for support. "I tried to show the judge my prescription that makes me dizzy sometimes, but he said it didn't matter. Can I appeal too?" "Absolutely," Dr. Lee said. "All defendants have the right to proper legal procedures, regardless of the type of violation." Kim felt his world collapsing around him. Not only was his conduct being investigated, but now every case he had handled was going to be scrutinized. Dozens of people would be filing appeals, each one a potential mark against his record. The appeals process will be handled by a different court to ensure fairness, Dr. Lee explained to the crowd. "You will receive information in the mail about how to proceed if you choose to appeal." She turned back to Judge Kim, who was still gripping his chair for support. "Your Honor, I will be submitting my complete report to the Supreme Court Administration within 48 hours. You will receive a copy of all findings and recommendations." Kim tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt like it was closing up. 15 years of work, 15 years of building his reputation and career, and it was all crumbling in a single morning because of one woman in casual clothes who had seemed like just another ordinary defendant. "The court administration will contact you regarding next steps," Dr. Lee said, picking up her folder and walking toward the courtroom exit. "Good day, Your Honor." 3 months had passed since that terrible morning in Judge Kim's courtroom. The summer heat was giving way to cooler autumn weather, and Kim found himself sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair in a government training center downtown. Around him sat 30 other judges from courts across the country, all looking as nervous and uncomfortable as he felt. At the front of the room stood Dr. Lee Minna, the same woman who had changed his life forever. She wore a professional navy blue suit now, and her hair was styled neatly. She looked completely different from the casual defendant who had appeared in his courtroom 3 months ago, but Kim would never forget her face. "Good morning, everyone," Dr. Lee said, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Welcome to the mandatory Judicial Ethics and Procedure Seminar. I know many of you would rather be in your own courtrooms today, but this training has become necessary due to problems we've discovered in courts across the nation." Kim shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew that his case had been the starting point for all of this. Dr. Lee's report about his courtroom had shocked the Supreme Court administration so much that they had ordered similar evaluations in 50 other courts around the country. "Bias often operates without our awareness," Dr. Lee continued, clicking to the first slide of her presentation. "We make quick judgments about people based on how they look, how they speak, or what we think their social status might be. The law requires us to see beyond these surface impressions." The slide showed 2 photographs side by side. One showed a woman in an expensive business suit, carrying a leather briefcase. The other showed the same woman in old jeans and a worn jacket. Kim realized with a shock that both pictures were of Dr. Lee herself. "I conducted an experiment," Dr. Lee explained. "I appeared in 10 different courtrooms over 6 months. Sometimes I dressed professionally, sometimes casually. I presented the exact same legal situation each time, a traffic violation with legitimate emergency circumstances." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a chart with numbers and statistics. "When I appeared professionally dressed, judges allowed me an average of 6 minutes to present my case. When I dressed casually, the average time was 90 seconds. A judge sitting 2 rows ahead of Kim raised his hand. Dr. Lee, surely the difference was due to other factors, not just appearance. That's exactly what I thought initially, Dr. Lee replied. But I used the same words, the same tone of voice, and presented identical documentation each time. The only variable was my appearance. Kim remembered that morning so clearly. He had taken one look at Dr. Lee in her casual clothes and immediately assumed she was just another person trying to avoid a traffic fine. He had never even considered that she might have a legitimate reason for speeding. Dr. Lee clicked to another slide showing the results of her broader investigation. After my initial findings, the Supreme Court administration authorized evaluations in 50 additional courts. The results were consistent across the country. The numbers on the screen were shocking. Poor defendants received maximum sentences 85% of the time, while wealthy defendants received maximum sentences only 30% of the time for identical violations. The most troubling finding, Dr. Lee said, was that most judges were completely unaware of their bias. When we interviewed them afterward, they genuinely believed they treated all defendants equally. Kim felt his face burning with shame. He had always considered himself a fair judge. Even now, part of him wanted to believe that his treatment of defendants had been equal, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. As a result of these findings, Dr. Lee continued, new protocols have been implemented in all district courts, effective immediately. She outlined the changes. Every case must have a minimum 5-minute review period. Judges must document in writing any mitigating circumstances presented by defendants. All defendants must be explicitly told they have the right to present evidence and explanations. Additionally, Dr. Lee said, undercover evaluations will now be conducted regularly in all courts. Legal specialists will pose as defendants to ensure these protocols are being followed. Kim thought about how different his courtroom had become since the incident. He now spent real time with each case, listening carefully to what defendants had to say. He had discovered that many people had legitimate reasons for their violations: medical emergencies, family crises, equipment failures. Just last week, an elderly man had appeared before him for a parking violation. The man explained that he had parked illegally because he was rushing to help his wife who had fallen at home. 3 months ago, Kim would have dismissed this as just another excuse. Instead, he had listened to the full explanation, reviewed the medical documentation, and reduced the fine significantly. The goal is not to let people avoid consequences for breaking the law, Dr. Lee explained to the room full of judges. The goal is to ensure that consequences are fair and take into account individual circumstances. She clicked to her final slide, which showed a quote from the Korean Constitution about equal justice under law. Every person who enters your courtroom deserves the same careful consideration, regardless of how they look or what assumptions you might make about them, Dr. Lee said. That is not just good law, it is basic human dignity. After the seminar ended, Kim approached Dr. Lee as she was packing up her materials. Dr. Lee, he said quietly, I want you to know that what happened in my courtroom has changed how I approach every case. I'm grateful for what you did, even though it was difficult. Dr. Lee looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn that morning 3 months ago. Judge Kim, the fact that you can say that tells me the system is working exactly as it should.